So I asked you, I was like, what can we talk about from the book that you think is like the most important thing that maybe you haven't been asked about? And that was education, which was, shocking to me as it is to, I bet, everyone else out here, because it's not sexy. Education is not like the thing that people want to come to watch a video about. It's like Jesus influenced
if you
education.
think about it, I have, like, when you write a book that is going to be a Christian book, it's going to ultimately become Christian curriculum for small groups. You're always thinking about 8 to 10 studies, 8 to 10 sessions. So your chapters need to be in that 8 to 10 range. And so I knew that. And also, man, this is such a big book anyway. I didn't want it to be bigger than that. So I'm trying to figure like which of these 8 to 10 topics should I talk about? But that ends up being a series of talks you could give publicly. And I have done a bunch of these, but I don't think I've ever done the talk on education. I think just because, like you said, it may not be sexy, although it's really amazing what can be recovered. Now, remember, this book looks at the impact that Jesus had on history, but not just that, is it impact from which we can reconstruct the story of Jesus. It's that second aspect that I'm looking for. Because you could say, well, Jesus has an impact on hospitals and on care for people who are sick. That's true. On the poor, care for the poor. But where would you go then to reconstruct the story of Jesus? That's the difficult part from that. Especially, you can't go back to the buildings and facilities because hospitals are updated all the time. And if you had a hospital in the 12th century, that's been torn down for a new building. So I really can't go back to that building, which is not true for education. It turns out universities, they love old buildings, and they want those old buildings to stay because it kind of speaks to their stature, their longevity.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I want to talk to you about universities a little bit later, because in chapters 8 and 9, I think 8 is the one where you talked about the universities, and we'll get into that in just a second. But I wanted to start with, so back to like the early church. What sort of tangible ways did the early Jesus followers cultivate the life of the mind? Like, what did that actually? So there's one question about, like, does the Bible actually teach that you should use your mind? But then, in what ways? The question I want to ask is, in what ways did they use their mind?
Yeah. So this is what's so great about the Christian worldview. Now, look, it could be said of Judaism, of Islam, and of Christianity that these are often called people of the book, whose chief source of information is the book from which they believe God has spoken in special revelation. So that does help, right? When you have a worldview that starts with information in a book. Now, what's interesting, though, is that Jesus does a couple of things which are unusual. He says that we should worship God with all of our heart, our soul, our minds. That word mind is slightly different when Moses makes the same proclamation. Jesus really uses the same placeholder that Moses uses for intensity or muchness in the Hebrew, right? Whereas Jesus uses this for intellect, for discerning rationally. So this is an idea that in order to worship God, you must worship him with the muchness that comes by adding a worship from the mind. And what's interesting is that Jesus then does the Great Commission. And he doesn't say, hey, I want you to go out and make converts. No, he says, I want you to go out and make disciples. Oh, that's totally different. Because now it's not just a matter of proclaiming a message and you say, yep, I'm in. It's about discipling somebody toward a goal, teaching them something. When Jesus said, go and make disciples, he inaugurated a teaching worldview. And this is why one of the earliest documents you have in the history of the church, after the Gospels, is a document called the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles. And it's a document that was used to catechize early believers. So one of the very first documents of Christendom is the training manual for Christians. In other words, we launch quickly as a teaching worldview, and that's exercised immediately. And there were some catechisms that would take, months or years before they would baptize people because they wanted them to know enough about what it is they were being baptized into. So this idea of creating a discipleship model, by the way, if you're going to do this, and now I need a book in order to disciple, but what if that book's not in your language? Well, now I got to teach you. What if you can't read? What if you don't even have any letters or alphabet in your culture?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have to create alphabets now and teach you how to read. And so now we've got an entire, it's not long before you see in both monasteries and cathedral schools that this is being expressed fully as a teaching worldview. And it's not long after that starts that you have people I think Irenaeus is one of the first who will say, hey, we should probably teach more than just Scripture. We should be teaching vocations. We should be teaching, I think Tertullian says this as well. You want to be able to teach other aspects of how to become good stewards of what God has given you in addition to just theology. So it's not long before you have a robust teaching curriculum that is part of what it is to become a Christian in the first place.
So people of the book, but let's connect that to like modern day. So how did that actually connect to the universities of today? And you've got a lot of really interesting facts about the current universities, like the top universities are all Christian or Christian influence or Christian started, founded.
Yeah.
So it's all really interesting. But connect the dots for us from the early church, the people of the book, to how education got to where it is today.
Yeah. So
and Christianity's
influence
on that.
Yeah, and it's rather organic. Now, look, this is not to say that every people group at some point puts in place a method by which to raise their young, at which to advance their culture, at which to teach values and truth claims to its own culture. This is all true. So I'm not saying that there were no other institutions of learning in antiquity, because there were. But when we say modern university, you have something in mind. Something very specific in mind. Usually you're thinking about a campus in which students arrive and there's a faculty, and the faculty attends to these resident students. And then at some point there's a course of curriculum, and it takes several years. And at the end of that, we award a diploma for a successful completion. Okay, that's what we think of when we think of modern universities. Now, that definition of the modern university appears in antiquity in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Those three institutions are founded by Christ followers. And those actually give birth to daughter universities, about 20, 22, 24, right in that range, that then become the universities from which scientists emerged in the scientific revolution. If you trace all of the most important scientists in the scientific revolution, you'll find that most of them trace back to a daughter church of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. So what's interesting about that is that it's happening organically. It begins in monasteries. As a matter of fact, monasteries became the highest repository of libraries. The monasteries started to collect the important works, not just of Christianity, but of the cultures in which they were situated. So it turns out that when Rome finally falls, much of what we know about Rome and its literature, we can recover not from Roman archives, but from Christian archives in ancient monasteries, because they were basically collecting this data. It's been said that the civilization of Rome is available to us today largely because of the libraries in Christian monasteries. As a matter of fact, the libraries were kind of seen like an armory for the monastery. Like a castle might have an armory. The monastery has a library, and that's the high value there was in reading and learning in monasteries. Now, at some point, each cathedral became a source of education. So as cathedrals emerged, now cathedral schools emerged as well. And it's this history from monasteries to cathedral schools, and I try to show this in the book, how these things feed into the planting of the first three modern universities. Now, what's also interesting about that, and I don't think I have it, so when we wrote this book, I had two research assistants, and a lot of it was just me geeking out on data. And I knew when I did it and collected all the data, there's no way this is going to make it into the book, because I wanted to put in lists, for example, of all of the universities founded by Christians compared to all the universities founded by Jewish people, compared to all the universities founded by Buddhists or Hindus or by atheists. In other words, if you could see the number of universities founded by Christians in comparison to any other group, I knew it would blow you away.
I have that quote. I have that quote saved. I was going to read it out loud because it was so awesome.
Well, and I can tell you, though, that I have it in the end notes. Here's what we did. We put 50 pages of end notes in the book, but we knew that wasn't going to cover it because there were like over 300 pages of end notes. So the other 279 pages are available in a PDF file. You'll see once you get to chapter 5 and you look in the end notes, it'll say, for more, see this PDF file you got to download. Because there's no way that would be it would be more than the size of the book, would just be the end notes. So, but I wanted to give you that list. Like, what are if I make this statement, what's that based on? Well, here's the list. And so I wanted to give you all those. But it's true that Christians have founded more institutions of education than any other group, and any other group combined. Yeah,
it's by 10, by a magnitude of 10.
Oh yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Now, a lot of these, not every one of these Christian institutions is still available, but that's also true of other educational institutions from other groups. They don't always have the staying power to make it into the 21st century. But I did make a list of all those. And so again, I'm only doing tip of the iceberg stuff, because what academic source can I go to get a list of Buddhist universities? I mean, no one's looking. I mean, there isn't a source for this, so I've got to just be creative here. So a lot of this, and I give you the sources I use in the book, so you can kind of look for yourself. I also think as we move forward, that if you can find an academic source online, like a lot of universities will have publicly available data through the university, especially when it comes to ancient documents. Well, they'll post the translated version of that ancient document on the university website in some archive. So I do point people to those, because I think those are immediately accessible by anyone who's reading, especially if you have the digital PDF, because it's still hyperlinked. You just think, there you go. Rather than, how many of these books did I want to collect? I have a stack that's huge, and I only keep the stack until I write the next book, because this is the only space I have for books. Once it's full, I got to move something out. But I usually keep, I have God's CrimeScene books here for years. But then at some point you have to push them aside. And do
you mean you have like extra copies of the book, or books that?
No, I mean, I had read 134 books to write God's CrimeScene. It was the most intensive period of time. It was ridiculous. And so I kept all the 134 reference books on my shelves. But at some point, okay, now you go out and you collect another 50 books to write the next book. Well, where am I going to put them? Like right now, you can't see it, but I've got a stack. I'm stacking here. There's 11 books sitting here that are ready for the next book. And so you just have to try to make room for these things.
Wow, you're already on the next one.
Yeah, we're talking about the next one now. But so the idea of education coming up, right? This view of the world that starts off by saying, hey, no, we are a thinking. You can argue. Now, here's what I think gets interesting. How many times do you see people in this generation argue that we're not a thinking group? I think you see it a lot. Yeah, and that's a shame, because we're coming out of a tradition that ought to compel us to be the foremost thinking group. Yet I think we've just embraced a cultural view of Christianity that is kind of like, hey,
just have faith.
Yeah, and I'm a Wallace, so if you're a Wallace and you're raised in a Wallace family, you're a Christian. That's really no. This is a completely different approach. But I think for a lot of us, we just claim these things because this is how we were raised, and this is kind of who we are, right? It's like a part of our innate identity, but we've not thought about it. For example, I know I'm a Wallace, but I haven't done a lot of research to even tell you what the Wallace family, where we came from. I haven't even done ancestry to really trace it back very far. Once I get past my great-grandparents, no idea who my great-great-grandparents were. I don't know their names. I don't know anything about them. Most of us, if you think about it, don't. Yet we live successfully with the last name we have, because it doesn't require us to do it anymore. Well, is that how we're treating our Christianity?